In 1945, in a hospital room in New York, the musical world was to lose one of the most famous composers of the 20th century. Bela Bartok, passionate Hungarian and unhappy exile, had finally succumbed to a long and debilitating illness and had left behind the manuscript of his last work, a viola concerto, which, he said, was ready in draft form. What did he mean, ready? Tibor Shirley, who eventually prepared the score for publication, felt it necessary to edit quite freely. But not everyone's in complete agreement with the version that appeared, the version that's played nowadays on the world's concert platforms. Some people still wonder. In 1978, New Zealand violist Donald Maurice was researching the viola concerto for performance, and he became increasingly dissatisfied with aspects of the reconstruction. He began a search for the truth behind Bartok's sketched manuscript. After viewing a copy of the manuscript in 1987, he resolved to complete his research by suggesting some new conclusions in the form of a revised score. We at the University of Auckland were very impressed with the results of this research, and we felt keenly that we should offer a performance by the university's student orchestra to an invited audience to show the results of the research, to document it and to bring it to life. Donald Maurice, lecturer in viola at the University of Auckland, completed his research on this score in the summer of 1993. Donald, what drove you to do this? It's a score that's stood the test of some 40 years, hasn't it?
Yes, well, I've always regarded the viola concerto as a work of great importance, but unfortunately it has been subjected to a great deal of criticism during its short 48 years. I suppose I was driven by a desire to help put the record straight on the authenticity of the work, but in order to do this, I soon realised that I needed to do a revised version to enable Bartok's intentions to be more accurately realised. After viewing a copy of the manuscript some years ago, my task became clear.
And how did you go about resolving these various problems then?
Well, firstly I divided the aspects of the reconstruction which I felt needed revision into the areas of note corrections and octave displacements, phrasing, tempo, structure, and lastly orchestration. The aspects of note corrections and octave displacements mainly apply to the viola part, where Tibor Shirley had written over 200 notes into different octaves, and in several places had changed notes to different pitches. Although these corrections were purely mechanical, they were, or at least they did have a dramatic effect on the playability and the musical effect. The aspect of phrasing proved the most elusive, as the manuscript shows very few indications. The main difference between Shirley's phrasing and mine is that where he tended to slur notes together into square rhythmic groupings, I have instead slurred notes within registers or voicings. The effect of this is to reinforce motivic shapes rather than reinforcing the pulse of the time signatures. From my observations of Bartok's music in general, I believe this is more idiomatic.
But on what grounds do you feel you could challenge tempi?
Well, surprisingly, that was one of the more straightforward aspects. You see here in the manuscript that Bartok actually wrote down his timings of each movement. It is a relatively straightforward exercise to calculate speeds to come out close to these timings. While the first and third movements are close to Shirley's tempi, the second movement and the middle section of the third are considerably slower. It would appear from an interview between David Dalton and Tibor Shirley that Shirley read the second movement timing as 3 minutes and 10 seconds, yet to add up to the total of 20 minutes and 15 seconds, it should be read as 5 minutes and 10 seconds. Now, with Shirley's marking of quarter note equals 69 reduced to around 44, and the middle section marked agitato by Shirley held in a much slower tempo, we come out pretty close to Bartok's timing.
And what about structure, Don? I imagine that's of the utmost importance, particularly in this work.
Yes, the aspect of structure is, I believe, of the greatest significance. The first movement had only a few bars added by Shirley, which I have removed. I've also reworked the bridge passage leading to the second theme in the recapitulation so as to remove extra material added by Shirley. The second movement is structurally unaltered, but the third movement has the most changes. The most significant change here is the removal of 4 bars of tutti added by Shirley in the closing bars. Listen firstly to the Shirley version. Now compare this with the original Bartok manuscript. It should be noted that a further 9 bars of Shirley's have also been removed, and the middle slower section has been restored to A flat major, as indicated in the manuscript. The most difficult section to deal with was the 13 bars between the first and second movements, the so-called lento parlando section. This also vexed Shirley, but as he was determined to include all material from the manuscript, he adapted the ending by introducing a bassoon solo to create a bridge to the second movement. I arrived at a quite different conclusion. The manuscript clearly shows a time signature of 2/4 at the end of this section. If linked directly to the allegretto introduction to the last movement, it becomes clear that this was probably the original intention. The slow movement proper also forms a perfect link to the allegretto. I therefore came to the inevitable conclusion that the 13-bar section was a first draft of a slow movement, but was replaced by the second movement proper. When removed, you will hear in the performance a magical transition from the C major triad ending the first movement directly to the E major opening of the second.
And lastly, the element of orchestration. How did you treat that?
Yes, well, here I've respected Shirley's suggestions in general and have only made changes when there was a clear indication from Bartok or to avoid unorthodox combinations of instruments. For instance, I've rescored so as to reduce Shirley's choice of 3 trumpets and 3 French horns to 2 of each. I've removed the woodwind flourishes from the middle section of the second movement and maintained a slower tempo throughout. This out-of-doors ideas and the woodwinds was freely borrowed by Shirley from the third piano concerto, but no trace of it can be found in the viola concerto manuscript. There are other minor differences, but the most dramatic is the opening of the work, which is normally heard as a duet between solo viola and pizzicato lower strings. Bartok's indication for solo viola and timpani is quite explicit.